All right, lesson 11.1. We're going to be talking about polynomials, and we're going to be combining some things. And this is going to look a little bit like we had early in the year, except now we've added variables that have exponents. Okay, but for the most part, this will feel pretty familiar as we start out here in chapter 11. So quick with the definitions, they're already filled out there for you, but when you hear something stated as a polynomial in X or a polynomial in Y, I think it kind of explains itself, but a polynomial is when you have multiple terms here in a group, but this would be a polynomial in Y. A polynomial in X would look like down in example number 2. Here you would say this is a polynomial in N. So you kind of get the idea there. And then the standard form of a polynomial, it's when we write these in decreasing order in terms of the powers of X. And when we were studying just recently the quadratic formula, we were always trying to get it into that standard form with the x squared up front and then the x and then the whole number. So that's in standard form. So we're going to try and do that as well. All right, example number 1, simplifying. Again, we've done this type of thing before, just maybe not with the y squared. So we're adding this whole quantity plus this whole quantity. Now, neither one of these has something that we need to distribute. There's technically a 1 out there, but obviously distributing a 1 doesn't change anything. So in this specific case, when you have a plus sign there and no leading coefficients, the parentheses are not really necessary. So I'm going to go ahead and rewrite it without the parentheses. And at this point, all we need to do to simplify this is combine like terms. Now remember that like terms don't just have the same variable. Those variables also must have the same power. So we can put the 2y squared together with the 4y squared. Notice when I boxed it in, I put the plus because that tells me this is a positive. So that's going to be a 6y squared. And I can put the 13y and the negative 3y together. So that's a positive 10y. So I write plus 10y. And I've got a negative 14 and a negative 24. Combine those to make a negative 38. And so since it's negative, I'm going to write minus 38. Okay. Now on this next one, I do have some things I need to distribute. 2 things. I've got the 6, and since this is a minus, I need to consider this a negative 1 and distribute. And we've done that before, but again, never just with anything that maybe had 3 terms in here. Okay, that would be a trinomial because there's 3 of them. And maybe not with an n squared, but it's really not going to change too much of what we're doing here. So this should seem familiar again. Distribute. So that's 66n. Distribute. The n squared is just going to stay, just like an x would stay. And so you only worry about the coefficients. So that's 48 n squared. And then don't forget to do also the 6 times the negative 2. So that's negative 12. You write minus 12. Now, I need to distribute this negative 1 as well. So all that's going to do is change the signs. It's a negative times 6. It's a negative times a 1. And a negative times a negative 9. So that's going to create a negative 6n squared. It's going to create a negative n. And it's going to flip this negative to a positive 9. Once we distribute, again, we combine like terms. Now, we're going to try and put this in standard form. So even though the first term I see here is an n, I'm going to go ahead and start, just to make my life easier and save myself some steps later, I'm going to start with the n squareds. So put those together, and that's 42n squared. I have a 66 and a minus n. It's a minus 1, so 66 minus 1, positive 65n. Negative 12, positive 9, that's negative 3. So when you fully simplify these, I'd like them in standard form with the n squared up front. If there was an n to the third, that would go even in front of that. So the higher the power, it should go in the beginning. So I saved myself a step. If I had done the n's first, I would have then had to rearrange it to get it into standard form. So I just started combining like terms in that order so that I could get that there quickly. Okay, example number 2, find the missing polynomial. So similar, we're going to be combining this and something that's missing, just like we did here, to create this answer. So instead of being given the two things to combine and simplify. They're giving you the answer basically, and you have to work backwards. So we just have to think. The first term here would have had some kind of x squared, and I went from a 10, I added something to it, and I got 17. So we should see that's a 7. So that would be 7x squared. I went from -5 to 8, so be careful. Don't put those together and say 3. Think about a number line for a second. If 0's here in the middle, -5 is over here, and 8 is up here. So I gotta add something to 5 to get it all the way up to 8. So I'd have to add 5 just to get to 0, and then another 8 to get up here. That's a total of 13. So I am adding 13x to this. And you can always go back and double check yourself if you're kind of not feeling great about that answer. Go ahead and just simplify it. Do -5 plus 13 and make sure you get 8. And you will. And then 22 became a 10. So we didn't add a positive. It went down from 22 to 10. So how much did it go down by? It went down by 12. So that means this is a minus 12 that I added to it. So you could do a quick double check. Add these, make sure you get this. Add these, make sure it's 8. Add these, make sure it's 10. And we're good. All right, next one. Same idea. A little bit extra going on, but it's just one more little term to deal with. So the y to the third power went from an 8 to a 10. That means we added a 2y to the third. We went from a -10y squared to a -15. So we got more negatives now. We added 5 negatives, so -5y squared. Went from 11 to 9. We went down 2 from 11, so that was a -2y. And from -5 to -12, that's again going down 7, so -7. And again, you could always double check yourself there. All right, pretty straightforward. Now let's go ahead and solve one of these. So we're going to use the skills that we just worked on to simplify, and then we're going to use the skills that we were practicing back in chapter 9, right before we came here, with the quadratic formula to help us solve a quadratic equation. All right, so before we can do anything, we need to simplify this. I see a minus here, so first thing I'm going to need to do is distribute it. So I'm going to get a -3x squared. I'm going to get a -2x. The negative changes this to a positive 24. Everything else is just going to come down. And now I'm going to start combining like terms. So a 4 minus 3 gives me just an x squared. I have a -5x and a -2x. That's a -7x. And I've got a -12 and a positive 24. You add those together, that's positive 12. So plus 12 equals 0. All right, now we're trying to solve this, not just simplify, solve it. So we want to find out, what does x equal? So because we have an x squared and an x, the little bell's got to be going off in your head. I can't just isolate one of those. Those are separate terms. I can't combine them. And I can't just get one by itself because the other one's going to be on the other side. And so far, we haven't learned any factoring or any other way to solve this. So right now, the only way we know how is with the quadratic formula. Now, this is already in a nice standard form. So I've got my a, my b, and my c, and I can run the quadratic formula to get this answer. So a is whatever's in front of x squared, which is a 1. B is in front of x, so that's -7. And c is our last term of 12. Remember, to be in standard form, this does need to be 0. So if it wasn't, I would have to rearrange it a little bit. And we're plugging directly into quadratic formula. Okay, so -b. So when I plug in a -7, it's going to actually look like this. This negative, and then the b turns to a -7. So those will end up going plus plus here. -7 squared. Still some people on chapter 9 quizzes and tests were plugging this in their calculator without parentheses and telling me that -7 squared is -49. That's not true. -7 times -7 is positive 49. So it might help you to do that step first. Minus 4 times a, which is 1, times c, which is 12. And on the bottom, it's 2 times a, which in this case is just 1. So let's simplify a little bit. 2 negatives make a positive 7, plus or minus. On the bottom, 2 times 1 is just 2. And in here, let's go ahead and combine. Grab your calculator. Don't worry about the square root yet. Just do the 49 minus 4 times 1 times 12. Okay, and it's 1. Next step, take the square root of 1. Some number times itself is 1. It's 1. But again, you can plug it in if you need to. Square root of 1 is 1. Now it's also negative 1, and that's why we have the plus and minus here. So 7 plus or minus 1 over 2. Got to split that now into 2 pieces. So 7 plus 1 over 2. 7 minus 1 over 2. One thing I did see on the Chapter 9 test a lot is people wanted to plug this all in at once. 7 plus 1 divided by 2. And get that. But if you actually did this one step at a time, 7 plus 1 is 8. 8 divided by 2 is 4. You get a different answer. So this first one is no good because when you were doing this in your head, which you easily could do, you don't need to plug it in the calculator, but you would do 7 plus 1 first. We know that this is actually kind of in parentheses on the top of this fraction here. You complete the whole quantity on top before you divide. But if you just type this in your calculator, calculator is always going to follow order of operations. So it sees a plus and a divide, and it's dividing first. It's actually doing 1 divided by 2 and then adding the 7, which you would never do, right? If I gave you this problem to do without a calculator, you wouldn't say, well, 1 divided by 2 is 0.5 plus 7 is 7.5, right? That wouldn't make sense. We know we're going to add and then divide. So you have to be smarter than the calculator and plug it in correctly so that it understands what you want. So this would be incorrect. I highly recommend not plugging it into the calculator. You're going to find more mistakes that way. Just do it by hand. 7 plus 1 is 8, and 8 divided by 2 is 4. 7 minus 1 is 6, and 6 divided by 2 is 3. And so x equals 4 and 3. Now remember what that actually means. That means if I took those two numbers and plugged them in up here to the original, this big complicated one up here, I plugged a 4 everywhere I see an x squared, this would come out true. This whole side, when you actually did all the math, would be 0, equals 0. And same thing if I plug a 3 in. So we did all that work to be able to solve for the x. So we found out what x actually equals.